Sophie didn't sleep that night. The images from the photos haunted her like a bad dream. Eric's insistence of innocence didn't ease her mind. It only made her more determined to uncover the truth. He'd claimed to have found the camera at a flea market, but Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that it was no coincidence. The next morning, Eric left for work without saying much, his demeanor cold and defensive. Sophie sat at the kitchen table. The photos spread before her like clues to a mystery she didn't ask to solve. The woman's face felt familiar in a strange, unsettling way. There was something about the way her smile curved, something Sophie couldn't place, but couldn't forget either. She decided to track down the seller of the camera. Eric had mentioned the flea market on the other side of town, so Sophie drove there, clutching the photos in her purse. The market was a sprawling maze of booths and tents, filled with trinkets, antiques, and junk. She weaved her way through the crowds, scanning each stall for something familiar. Finally, at the far end of the market, she saw it. A table lined with old cameras, lenses, and film. The vendor was a wiry old man with a white beard and a sharp eye that followed her as she approached. "Looking for something specific?" he asked, his voice gravelly. Sophie hesitated, then pulled the camera from her bag. "Do you remember selling this?" The man squinted at the camera and then nodded. "Oh, yeah, that's a beauty. Sold it a couple weeks ago. Found it in a storage unit I picked up." "A storage unit?" Sophie's heart raced. "Do you know who it belonged to?" The man shook his head. "No idea. Just some old boxes and junk. But that camera, it was something special. Still had film in it, too. A rare find." Sophie bit her lip, debating whether to press further. "Do you still have anything else from that unit?" The man tilted his head, considering. "Maybe. I kept a few things that didn't sell." "Why?" "I need to know who owned it," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "It's important." The vendor scratched his beard and gestured for her to follow him to the back of his stall. He rummaged through a box, pulling out a few items: a leather-bound notebook, a set of keys, and a business card. Sophie's heart skipped a beat when she saw the card. It was for a private investigator. This was in the same box as the camera, the vendor said. "Maybe it'll help." Sophie took the card with shaking hands. The name printed on it read Paul Weston, Private Investigations. There was a phone number scrawled underneath. Sophie stared at the card, the weight of her next step sinking in. Whoever Paul Weston was, he had answers she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. Sophie sat in her car outside the flea market, gripping the private investigator's business card like it might burst into flames. Her mind raced with questions. Why would a private investigator have owned the camera? And why would it contain photos of Eric and this mystery woman? The only way forward was clear. She had to call Paul Weston. She dialed the number with trembling fingers, her breath catching as it rang. After 4 long rings, a gruff voice answered. "This is Paul Weston." Sophie swallowed hard. "Hi, my name is Sophie. I believe you own a camera that ended up at a flea market. It had film inside, photos of my husband and another woman." There was a long pause on the other end. "What kind of photos?" Weston finally asked, his tone cautious. "Intimate ones," Sophie said, her voice cracking. "I need to know why you had them." Another pause. "Meet me at my office. We'll talk there." He gave her an address on the edge of the city. Sophie didn't wait. She started the car and drove straight there, her mind a whirlwind of dread and determination. Paul Weston's office was exactly what she imagined. A dimly lit room crammed with filing cabinets, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee. Weston himself was a stocky man in his late 50s, with tired eyes that suggested he'd seen too much. He gestured for her to sit across from his cluttered desk. "Let me see the photos." Sophie hesitated, then pulled them from her bag and slid them across the desk. Weston flipped through them, his expression unreadable. "I remember this case," he said, leaning back in his chair. "It was a few years ago. A woman hired me to follow a man she suspected was cheating on her. Your husband." Sophie's heart felt like it stopped. "What? Why?" "She thought he was seeing someone behind her back," Weston explained. "Turned out she was right, but I never handed over the photos. She backed out of the case, said she didn't want to ruin anyone's life. I boxed up the files and forgot about them." "Who was the woman?" Sophie's voice was barely a whisper. Weston sighed. "I don't remember her name, but I can check my records." He stood and rummaged through one of his filing cabinets. Sophie sat frozen, her mind replaying the last few years of her life. Who could have suspected Eric? And why would they let it go? Weston returned with a thin folder and flipped it open. Inside were notes, receipts, and another photo. Sophie stared at it, her breath hitching. The woman in the picture was the same one from the camera. "Her name was Miranda," Weston said. "But there's something you should know." Sophie braced herself. "What?" "She wasn't your husband's lover. She was his daughter." The room seemed to spin. Sophie blinked, trying to process what she'd just heard. "Daughter?" she echoed. "Yeah," Weston said grim. He didn't want anyone to know about her. Said her mother was involved in something Messier legal case or some kind of scandal. He hired me to make sure no one found out. Sophie's world felt like it was collapsing. Eric had a daughter? A secret life? She stared at the photo again, her pulse pounding in her ears. This was worse than she ever imagined, and now she had to decide what to do with the truth. Sophie sat in stunned silence, the weight of Weston's revelation pressing down on her chest. Eric had a daughter, an entire human being he'd kept hidden from her for years. Questions tumbled over each other in her mind, fighting for priority. Why hadn't he told her? Why the secrecy? And what was this messy legal case Weston mentioned? "I don't understand," she finally managed to say, her voice shaky. "Why would Eric hide something like this? Why wouldn't he just tell me?" Weston leaned back in his chair, his weathered face softening. "People keep secrets for all kinds of reasons, ma'am. Shame, fear, pride. Maybe he thought he was protecting you, or maybe he was protecting himself." Sophie's throat tightened as she stared at the photo of Miranda. She looked so much like Eric, those same sharp cheekbones, the same mischievous glint in her eyes. And her mother? Sophie asked, "What about the legal case?" Weston thumbed through his notes. It wasn't just messy, it was high profile. Her name was Grace Mitchell. She was a whistleblower in some corporate fraud case. Made a lot of enemies. I remember Eric saying it would destroy him if anyone connected him to her. Sophie felt like she was sinking in quicksand. Eric hadn't just kept a daughter's secret. He'd been living in the shadow of a scandal, balancing lies like a juggler with one too many balls in the air. "Does Miranda know about me?" Sophie asked quietly. Weston shook his head. "Not as far as I know. When I was hired, the girl was barely 20. Eric was trying to keep tabs on her, make sure she wasn't caught up in anything dangerous because of her mother. I don't think he ever wanted her to find out about you either." Sophie pressed her hands to her temples, trying to stave off the pounding headache forming there. "Why would he give me that camera?" she murmured. "He must have known what was on it." Weston shrugged. "Maybe he didn't. Or maybe he thought you'd never develop the film. Either way, you've got to ask yourself, what are you going to do with this information?" The question hung in the air like a storm cloud. Sophie had no answer. She gathered the photos and folder, her movements mechanical, and left the office in a daze. When Eric walked through the door that evening, Sophie was waiting in the kitchen. The photos sat in a neat pile on the table next to the notebook and Weston's business card. Eric froze when he saw her expression. "We need to talk," Sophie said, her voice steady but cold. Eric's eyes flicked to the table, and she saw the realization dawn in his face. He sank into the chair across from her, silent. "You have a daughter," Sophie began, her words cutting through the air like shards of glass. "You lied to me. You've lied to me for years." Eric opened his mouth to speak, but Sophie raised a hand to stop him. "Don't. Just don't. I've already talked to the private investigator. I know everything." Eric's face paled, but to Sophie's surprise, he didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned forward, his elbows on the table, and buried his face in his hands. "It wasn't supposed to come out like this," he said, his voice muffled. "I was trying to protect you." Sophie slammed her hand on the table, startling him. "Protect me? Protect me from what?" "From knowing the truth about my own husband." Eric sighed, his shoulders slumping. "It's not just about you. Grace Miranda's mother, she got caught up in something dangerous. I didn't want it to touch our lives. I thought I could keep it separate." Sophie's voice cracked as she spoke. "You thought wrong." She stood, the chair scraping against the tile floor. "I need time to think, Eric. Don't follow me." Sophie grabbed her coat and walked out the door, leaving Eric alone with the tangled mess of their shared life. She had no idea where she was going, only that she couldn't stay in that house with those lies any longer. Sophie spent the night driving aimlessly, the city lights blurring past her as she replayed the last few days in her mind. Eric's betrayal wasn't just about his lies, it was about the years they'd spent together. The quiet moments, the love they'd built on a foundation that now felt like sand. She pulled into a quiet park and sat in the car, staring at the horizon as the sun began to rise. Her thoughts were a storm of anger, confusion, and pain, but one truth cut through the chaos. She couldn't go back to life as it was. Not without answers. Not without deciding what she truly wanted. When she finally returned home, Eric was sitting in the living room, his face drawn and weary. He looked up as she entered, but didn't speak. Sophie set her keys on the counter and sat across from him, the weight of her decision heavy in the air. "Tell me everything," she said. "No more half-truths, no more omissions. If you want even the smallest chance of fixing this, I need to know the whole story." Eric nodded slowly, his voice low and steady as he began. He told her about Grace Mitchell, a whirlwind romance from years ago. Grace had been fiery, passionate, and fiercely independent, but also entangled in a corporate fraud case that made her a target. When she discovered she was pregnant, Eric had wanted to step in, but Grace had refused. She didn't want her child's life overshadowed by the scandal that consumed her own. For years, Eric had kept tabs on Miranda from a distance, ensuring she was safe without disrupting her life. But as Miranda grew older, she started asking questions. Grace passed away when Miranda was in college, and Eric was left with a choice: tell Sophie the truth or continue the charade. "I thought I was protecting you," Eric said again, his voice breaking. "I didn't want you caught up in Grace's past or in mine." Sophie stared at him, her emotions warring inside her. "Do you even understand what you've done to me?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Every time you lied, you chipped away at us, at our marriage. And now, I'm the one who has to decide whether any of this is worth saving." Eric looked at her, his eyes glassy with tears. "I know, and I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. But you have to know I never stopped loving you." Sophie stood, her heart aching as she looked down at the man she thought she knew. "I need time," she said quietly. "I can't just forgive this. I don't even know if I want to." Eric nodded, understanding. "Take all the time you need." In the weeks that followed, Sophie didn't make any rash decisions. She met Miranda, who turned out to be kind, funny, and heartbreakingly curious about the father who had hidden her existence for so long. Sophie couldn't bring herself to hate the girl. She was innocent in all of this. But with every meeting, every conversation, Sophie came to a realization. Eric's secrets had been born of fear, but fear wasn't an excuse. It wasn't love, and it wasn't something she could build her future on. One evening, as the leaves turned gold and red, Sophie sat Eric down in the same kitchen where their life had unraveled. She looked into his eyes and spoke the words she never thought she'd say. "I can't stay," she said. "Not like this. I've spent too much of my life believing in a version of you that doesn't exist. I need to figure out who I am without your lies." Eric didn't fight her. He didn't beg. He simply nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I'll always love you, Sophie. I'm so sorry." Sophie stood, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders as she turned to leave. She had no idea what the future held, but she knew one thing. It was hers to create, free from the shadows of Eric's secrets. As she closed the door behind her, she felt a sense of clarity for the first time in weeks. The past was a tangled mess, but the future was a blank canvas, and Sophie was ready to paint her own story.